Hello everyone, today we talk about Crusader Horses of Outremer, with some references also to the Reconquista, that I want to discuss today for many reasons. First of all, it's a new topic to me. I just learned a few, frankly, about it. But from all I've learned from it, I got a substantial opinion that fits with a broader one that I have, relatively to this idea of East-West military technology, practice, skills, and in general, that had for many years. I mean, generally in the West, I want to remain as broad as possible, has been seen as kind of in a too sharply divided way, right? Either something was invented from one side or the other, and there was never any, form of, of a coexistence of parallel developments that actually met in producing very similar results, right? And this is a view that derives from the usual, I would say, technologistic prejudices that we have in the West. Not elsewhere things are much better, but we are a bit obsessed with these things, like from which people has that other learned that, and this happens. Like there is, historically speaking, in the history of technology, of course, a great importance given to, of course, exchanges, interactions. Of course, we do learn from our neighbors, right? Even if the objective is to massacre them, like in this case. But I think it's also worth remembering that, and especially in times like these, like in medieval times, where objectively technological potential was the one that it was, and societies were not drastically different among each other, there were very often parallel developments. And I'm not just talking about the inventions, right, or innovations even, but about the sheer practice of warfare, right? And there is this idea that I remember from last year was even questioned once I made a video about this, talking about the origins of European chivalry, and that somewhat the West has been schooled in some way by the East, so that especially the moment of the period of the Crusades has been this great moment of emanation from the Near East into Europe of many, many techniques, skills, etc. And I've always been very skeptical about this, and this has nothing to do with any intercultural clash. You know that I talked extensively and very willingly about Islamic history. I like it a lot. I love to dip in that, and I always stress, I tend to picture every civilization, even in the brutality of wars and of conflict and horrible things that happen throughout all history. Let's say, picking the best of it and saying, okay, yeah, in this ocean of bad things, this civilization actually accomplished something, right? And it's interesting, it's positive to talk about this, because essentially we have always been massacring each other, historically speaking, and there are no substantial differences in what we do. We are firstly human beings, then we are all a lot of other things, or narrower things, let's say. But this is more like saying, let's attribute the do to this civilization and this other, without pretending that there has necessarily to be a great asymmetry, as the one that we're used to think, right? And the Crusades are obviously an important meeting ground in this sense, because you can't compare military systems who were apparently, in fact, different from the others, one from the other, that had different cultures, different traditions, and surely different inclinations, etc. But that, in practice, in my opinion, were actually much more similar than they were, so that today we will specifically observe how all this idea that chivalry is somewhat something that the Westerners had to copy or adapt from the East, because otherwise they wouldn't have not developed their own heavy cavalry, stuff like that, is false, right? And it's not just false because, of course, we know that this is a very simplistic put, and actually it doesn't stand a chance in front of even macroscopical evidence in every single field of knowledge that we can investigate about those times. But more precisely, that European chivalry and horsemanship, specifically today, was, that we'll be discussing specifically today, I mean, was actually as advanced, at least, as the one that existed in the Near East. You know, it even made the rhyme, right? And therefore, today I would like to present you with, and we're talking specifically about horses here. What are these breeds or types? Because we don't actually know how to define them precisely. Remember that the Middle Ages didn't have the scientific categorizations that we used to think through now as moderns. So in the sources, how can you actually distinguish a breed from a horse type? I mean, it's very complicated. One thing is having the actual skeleton of the horse and saying, okay, well, yeah, at that point you can't look certain things, but even that is rare. And of course, instead, the sources talk to us relatively a lot, right, about this. Remember that after the migration era, all this big area of Europe and Mediterranean, the Near East, was all a bit reviving everywhere, and with an astonishingly degree of homogeneity, the mounted element, right? There was a shared horsemanship and chivalric culture that you can't find in parallel with all these peoples. That surely was revived from several channels, right? We don't have to think that, I don't know, for example, all the waves that came from the Eurasian steppes at one point didn't influence, actually, well, I don't know. When we talk about the stirrup, for example, that was brought into Western Europe seemingly by the Avars, right? Even the Byzantines didn't quite seemingly got them from the east, from this Sassanid frontier that most likely took it from the west, at least the iron one, the metal ones that are the only ones basically survived ever. We all know that the stirrup didn't change in itself anything, right? Never think that it's the stirrup that created medieval chivalry. That's like an asinine mistake. That's not how chivalry is born. If you, I have already made extensive videos about this, but the stirrup was starting being used because there was a type of cavalry that was developing, requiring its use, right? So that, yeah, when do the Avars arrive in 6th century, Pannonian Plain, what is the Frank, take a battle of Hastings, how many Normans already used stirrups at those times? I mean, it was still developing, right? And there is all the technicality of warfare that today we will not be looking at because we concentrate on the animal, right? But just for saying that this is not a matter of personal opinion, right? Of course, it is up to a certain point, but these are widely known macroscopical historiographical, assessments that here that I hope there is nobody that really wants to challenge, because it would be a waste of time to be honest with that. Today we challenge the stereotype. In fact, Crusaders' horses, the ones coming from Europe, were actually worse than the Arab or Turkish ones. This is very, very debatable. And as I was saying before, actually we do have a relatively good documentation about such things, but it's still that we don't know much overall, right? Our problems are not solved. This is a topic that probably requires further investigation, because I think about certain macroscopical topics like, I don't know, cavalry forces in Muslim Spain. We don't have much, right? Which is weird, because that was one of the largest powers in the West. It's important whether it had horses or not. That has to do with, in fact, this vexata question about the Iberian or Berber horsemanship tradition and all this stuff. And I would like today to proceed in this way. First of all, to give this general picture and background, even stating things that are stereotypical, that we will tell, being stereotypical and therefore debatable. And then I would like to help myself with this beautiful article written by Jürg Gassmann, that is a person I have a great opinion of, titled East Meets West, Mounted Encounters in Early and High Medieval Europe, that dedicates to paragraphs to the Muslim invasion of Iberia and the Crusades, relatively to this topic, talking about horsemanship here. He is a person that actually I discovered he was supporting me one of the few conflictual situations in the when I share my videos on Facebook to widen my pool of followers, that I thought he was, lots of people interact with me. I didn't know him. I found this article on Academia Edu, and I was surprised enough to know that it was the author of this article about this topic that today I wanted randomly to discuss. So I want first of all to thank him for this article. Actually, I'm recording now without him knowing that I will be talking about him, but it's a very well written article. It's very fascinating, very interesting, and he points out these problems. His objective with listening to his two paragraphs I concentrated on is to list a considerable amount of evidence about the fact that, in fact, we don't know much. Like, we don't have to say that Western horsemanship was superior to the Eastern one. No. Here, the situation that emerges is that fundamentally the situation was parity, right? And I would like also to make this premise that every mistake about what I will be saying is from my side. The article is very precise, very properly researched. Of course, I will leave you a link below in the description, but you can find it also on academia.edu, as I was telling you before. And therefore, every miscomprehension, misunderstanding, it's entirely my fault. So don't, please, if you have to criticize me, don't criticize the author, because he's a very prepared person, and I just decided to quote him like it's proper. And I can tell you, well, here it's from pages, I think it's the numeration of a publication that it's not it's in entirety, but I think here is from pages 75 to 100. Well, the bibliography begins at 98. So okay, and I don't know actually where this was published. I didn't check that, so forgive me for that. But once again, it's open source, so you can find it, and it's very interesting. So I will be using it following this reflections, a bit more simplified, because of course I want to make an original synthesis, not a copy, right? Alright, so what we will be talking now about, well, first of all, stating the obvious, as it's, fair start, which is the fact that the Franks, let's go the Crusaders in this way. So, first of all, little premise, here we will be talking chiefly about the Near East, the Ottoman states and cavalry. And afterwards we will take a look at Spain, at the Iberian Reconquista as well, because that's also kind of a overlooked, kind of almost forgotten theater of, in fact, of the clash between Christianity and Islam during the Middle Ages, and a hell of a battleground, like where horsemanship had a long tradition since ancient times. And that has extremely fascinating developments for saying what exactly? To say that this was a system that we can't just study. Today we will leave out, for example, the Baltic Crusades, right? But that would be interesting as well. What kind of horses, I don't know, the Lithuanians used, because that, I think it's enormously fascinating. We'll get there at one point. We already talked about Lithuanian knights at one point. We will do it again. So this will be essentially about the Ottoman states and in part the Reconquista, right? Because these are different. These are let's say, I don't want to paradoxically stress too much the differences between, once again, Eastern, like Christian Europe and Islamic, Near East, North Africa. these were broad systems that worked largely in similar ways, right? And that had a freaking lot of interactions, and therefore shared practices as well, right? So obviously, and what I will be saying now actually fits in a broader consideration on medieval warfare of the time, because there are many things that, in my opinion, that I would like to deepen, and it will be deepening on Schwerpunkt, like, where did crossbows spread first, right? Or better, who made its greater use at the end of the day? I'm personally convinced that there was a much more widespread use of already at the beginning of the Crusades of crossbow in the West, rather than in the East, right? Or at least that there was some. This is a bold statement, actually, but by the 12th century, that's pretty much obvious. It's difficult sometimes to measure it. Incidentally, I studied the 14th century, which is much better documented, and already in there you can see how difficult it is to assess certain quantities and certain structural tendencies and transformations and so on. But there are many hints that make me personally, and many other scholars actually, they're much more experienced and competent than I am, of course, suggest that all this great idea that this inferiority complex, right, or better, over of superiorization complex of the East towards the West in this context is not quite true, especially because the same West was very diverse at the time. Like, there were different areas of the of medieval Europe, also in terms of horsemanship, also the spread of certain technologies, right? Not all regions were developed at the same level. Not all military cultures had developed in the same way, right? So that there are differences, and we will be highlighting them. So the most evident thing is that Franks, right, depended heavily on the charge of their mailed knights, and this, as a consequence, made horses extremely valuable in Outremer, right? We know that. We know that because it's not about the Outremer in itself that surely had problems of shortages of horses. There were large imports were needed, and the communications were difficult. I mean, it was not easy. But the horse was necessary in itself. It was part of that military culture, right? The vassalic beneficiary system and feudalism was expanding towards that direction. And the mailed knight fighting on horseback with these shock charges was quite a thing that was recognized, in fact, by the same Byzantines and the same Muslims at the time. Everybody recognized the ability of this people at the time, and even before, because this is an old, even ethnographical cliche, maybe, that doesn't make it less true, but you can find as early as the 6th century Strategicon, right, where it says that these peoples with blonde hair, even made a video about that. It talks essentially about the Germanic peoples. Many people think that they talk about the Franks, but I'm convinced that at that time the Byzantines had the Longobards all over the place, and that's essentially what they were thinking at. But that's a pretty homogeneous space. Of course, they were categorized. They were fitting all the Germans in that group. Which is very meaningful also because sometimes we get the different impression, like that, I don't know, even the Vikings or the Anglo-Saxons didn't make the use of cavalry because it was not in their tradition. I don't believe it. I've never believed it. There is no evidence to support that, and actually all the evidence we have hints towards another direction. That of course doesn't mean that, I don't know, Britain was exploding because it was full of horses. No, it's never been so. It's never been quite a place with a lot of horses, frankly. But of course they used it, and not just to go from a battlefield to another, but literally to fight. And we actually have explicit evidence about that from that same period. But that's another story. We'll discuss it in another on another occasion. And I think, first of all, and we will see later, this evidence of same Byzantines and Muslims praising the Western knights for their ability as cavalrymen, right? This is not just about the fact that they were brave, they were courageous, they were rough. Of course, there were also negative stereotypes about them, but as horsemen, nobody had to teach them anything. This is the picture we get. The problem during the Crusades in Outre-mer was increased. Like, having horses was becoming a problem. You know that a major problem of the Crusader states was replenishing their troops, right? Not just horses, of course, were extremely costly, especially war horses, the destriers. Yeah, and there were also runners and other. But the runners especially were much more widespread than is commonly thought, right? Actually, knights in battle preferred more often to fight on runners than on destriers, right? It all depends on the tactical context, but let's say given the larger amount of military practice aside from pitched battles were objectively rare, the runner is much more useful than a destrier. That costs a freaking lot. It's like having a Ferrari today, or even more than that, actually. So you don't want to in such a dangerous business like war, to expose it more than necessary, right? But aside from this, the main problem of this states was really replenishing knights, right? Having people, the majority, of course, there's the first crusade, that is this great success that is miraculous if you think about it, for many reasons. But many crusaders at a certain point they want to come back to Europe, and also some that come there, they don't stay for very long. It's like 6 months. They do their pilgrimage, do whatever the thing. They fight a little bit, and then they come back in Europe because they think they had saved their souls in this fashion. But those who remained were perfectly aware of the problem, right? And of course, the knights were kind of elite. Like, even the Kingdom of Jerusalem, I think it never had more than a few hundreds. Heavily armored cavalry in its among its vast. In the actual armies that were levied, because it was an enormous resource, right? Then of course there were lots of other troops. We made a video at one point. If you go in the Crusades playlist, you will find it's about the Turkopoles, right? That were these often said Turkish-born or Byzantine or however local, but sometimes even Frankish, let's be honest, cavalry that fought fundamentally as lighter horses, not necessarily completely lighter. There were even heavily armored shock cavalry, Turkopoles, in smaller numbers, but they were essentially the response or the equivalent, the literal equivalent of the Muslim horse archers of the Turkish and at that point even Arab tradition, because let's be honest, that's how fast peoples learn certain tactical styles. We have to stay open, right, to not to forcibly associate like that everybody would belong to that people knew how to go on horseback and that other didn't, right? This is probably the most stupid thing one can do in such contexts, because it doesn't pay. It's not showed, it's not proved by any evidence, right? So, and naturally, the Crusaders therefore partly adapted to local warfare. Turkish archery tactics needed, in part, to be copied, right? But simply came by sheer practice, by sheer imitation, sure, but sheer necessity. the Westerners never gave up the core model of their warfare, right? Also, and this is often also what is challenged sometimes, because it was pretty damn effective. Like many people tend, there is this defeatism that always comes, I don't know, here in the West when thinking about, I don't know, the Crusades, or I don't know, the Vietnam War. Like, I'm jumping from a moment to another, but there is, and this idea that the West doesn't win against guerrilla tactics, doesn't win against skirmishes, right? There were these great defeats that had to happen because, yeah, let's interpret history deterministically, because we know, of course, that everything has to happen deterministically. Well, no, it doesn't happen like that. And actually, in the case of the Crusades, in spite of their strategic failure in the end, the loss of Outremer states, from a strictly tactical point of view, Western tactics proved to be, I can't say honestly superior to the local ones, because there are victories, actually very famous, think about Arsuf, but there are many others, that actually displayed a greater symmetry and shifted in favor of the West, actually, what is commonly thought. Think about the Battle of Dorilia, the point that this Turkish horse archers start showering the Crusader army with arrows, and they realize that they don't die because they're covered in iron, they're covered in gambesons that are pretty damn thick, by the way. Never think gambeson is kind of soft thing you can't pierce easily. Also you have to sharpen your blades in a quite effective way in order to cut through that. And guess what? I mean, that was an effective response of a military system that, albeit, considered rough, primitive, because I don't know, we have to stress the fact that in the 11th century, 12th century, Western Europe was awakening from a condition of inferiority. I don't think so. Like, of course, it was awakening in certain ways. Of course, I don't know, the Islamic world, culturally speaking, had been more advanced, etc. But we kind of exchange certain issues for others, in my opinion. And I think that especially from a strictly military point of view, of course, Europe was, politically speaking, a total mess. It was fragmented. Public authority was basically non-existent because it was all private authority at the end of the day working. But it was working as well, and that is not to be forgotten. And even the Crusades contributed to that. That is to say, to make the Europeans develop in their home a better organization in order to participate to the crusade, right? So it was not a passive the evolution from a passive exposure to something, but actually an active propositivism to accomplish something, right? And that especially from a military point of view, in terms of horsemanship, and especially sometimes of even both in individual and in collective training, let's put it in this way, Europeans were surely at the level of the Easterns. There is no proof to think otherwise, right? And in the case specifically of Turkish archery tactics, I'm personally convinced, maybe I will change it at one point, that this idea that the Western cavalry couldn't run after those guys that were just exposed to archery and they were done for, it's not true. Like, it is true that the Crusaders screwed up many times. They made poor decisions, that both at the tactical and strategic level. They had a lot of problems, especially deriving from this political fragmentation that translated itself into the battlefield. In fact, the difficulty of controlling all the various elements of the army. That's why also, for example, the Battle of Arsuf is so important and famous, because at that point Richard of England was, a hell of a commander at that point. It's not a matter of courage, it's a matter of cold blood and intelligence and ability to keep all of those guys to launch the attack at the same moment and to make it to be right. It's also a matter of time, right? There is a right timing involved, especially in cavalry warfare, that is everything, that can really make the difference between victory and defeat quite easily, right? So, and that's what makes it a winning model. I mean, the Western one, because it proved on the field to be successful, right? This has nothing to do that there were Westerners, there were Christians, that those were Muslims, there were Eastern. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do that military system proved to be able to cope with and to defeat the that other one, right? And this is a tactical assessment. It has nothing to do with how the Crusades ended, right? What happens on the battlefield is just a consequence of many other things that are effectively outweighing what happens there. So, by a certain margin, of course, but it's like the pinnacle of a mass of it. It's like the tip of an iceberg, right? So aside from this background ideas, we have to look more closely at how horses were replenished in the Near East. First of all, there was this great concern that is to be found also later on in Europe about the so-called restore or restore. Restore. I don't know how to pronounce all the various versions of the name. That was basically the replacement of a vassal's horse when killed or crippled, right? Horses are terribly resistant beasts, but they're in terms of strength, etc., endurance, they're extremely resilient. They can cover even 150 kilometers in a day. But if they break one of their legs, that they're done for, right? You can't use them anymore. So this was a big deal because these horses, as we said, especially war horses, were extremely expensive, and we're not talking just about the horse in itself, but also about the logistical demands. Like, have you an idea of how much a horse eats or drinks, right? And think about drinking in places like, the Syrian desert, right? Or that was a big deal. Like, there were even times in the years you couldn't mount up an expedition when the streams were dry and there was not enough water to drink. But that is a problem that can happen even in Northern Europe, right? It's not a novelty really. If you have an army of thousands of people and you don't have a close, in this times of history, at least a close basin of drinkable water, you can't even be in the most rainy, Britain or whatever, but that army will die of thirst and will the epidemics will break out and etc., right? So it was a big deal. Also, that shows also, frankly, how pretty damn developed and sophisticated medieval logistics was. One of the things that really grinds my gears is when I hear people saying, "Oh, no, the medieval logistics was so inferior to the Roman one." I love the Romans, as you know. That's simply garbage, right? If you study medieval armies' speeds in terms of march, etc., unless they're not under particular dear straits, into particular dear straits, and they have terrible complications like being harassed from the enemy or marching on 40 degrees under the Near Eastern sun in a desert without close springs or other streams. The average speed of an army at its best is 30 kilometers a day, and this never changed. I mean, literally from the classical times, late antique, early medieval, high medieval, low medieval, late. That's exactly the same exact speed. But we needed to invent that at one point. Yes, medieval civilization was so backwards and primitive, and these things we leave them to people who objectively don't know anything about history. I'm not talking just about the Middle Ages, because if you think something like that, you basically don't know anything, nor even about modern age or the ancient world. Like that. But aside from this, the restore, right, was a big deal. Like there is all a historiography revolving around it for Europe specifically, where this restore, this compensation for the loss of the horses and even other gear, telling the truth, but now we're talking about horses, was a big business. Like, these were strictly regulated things, because there was all an administration behind this. There were the deputies to check the horses. Well, they had to mark them. They had to check, before the battle, after the battle. They had, because some owners even crippled their horses on purpose in order to be, like a fraud, right? To be recompensated, like with insurance today. That happens, right? So, and sometimes the money shifted by the restore was so big that it changed even political matters, right? There were certain classes in medieval Europe at one point started saying, especially middle classes, city-states, or said, why do we have to pay this money to the elite? It was a big deal. There was a lot of negotiation and conflict revolving around this, and there's a part of historiography that I'm not really aware of that actually states that the practice of restore actually evolved in Frankish Syria in the early 12th century, exactly because of the difficulties that the Crusader states were facing at the time for replenishing horses, which is very interesting and very plausible, telling the truth. I personally don't, I think that there's never like a starting point of things in history. Like, things happen and have always happened more or less with the same dynamics. So I wouldn't be surprised if similar practices were already existing, I don't know, 1 century before somewhere in Europe. I'm pretty sure that it was the case. But definitely here you can see an intensification, right? And especially because that environment, marked by this chronicle shortages of resources, not just of horses themselves, but also what was needed to buy them, for example, brought this attention towards such an expensive good to be increasingly regulated, and so on. There is this Islamic author, Usama, that records this enacted, in which Tancred of Hauteville, I believe, told his men during a battle around 1110 that since his knights were fearing for their horses, that the Tancred promised them to replace all those injured ones that would have been injured, let's say, in the fight, right? Quote, the horses are my property. Whosoever of you loses his horse shall have it replaced. Which is very fascinating, because here it stresses, of course, the idea that the horses are my property. They're saying that this is a powerful statement, politically speaking, because it's basically dealing with his knights, like, I provided you with those horses. They're not your horses. And this is very important, because actually the relation between the medieval knight and his horse is, is very, very, very intense, let's say, in this way. You can see it from very long time before, since the migration era. I mean, the horse is a bit if not the alter ego of the warrior, which is the sword, but that at least it's faithful companion that always appears, and these were professionals of wars who were trained to fight on horseback during all their life. So in battle, actually, just know this, that if you have a good horse but you're a bad cavalryman, or even if you have a bad a bad horse and you're a good cavalryman, it doesn't work. You need to be a good horseman and to have a good horse, and you need, however, especially that alchemy, that chemistry, let's say, that works between you and the animal, because you have to rely on one another. And this is true what every cavalryman or every horseman will tell you, and that this is actually the case. The horse is an astonishingly intelligent animal. They understand a lot of things, and they do understand what's going on, right? Horses are also extremely violent. There were horses can be trained to be extremely aggressive animals. I mean, horses actually fought against other animals during battles. They did against other men. They bit. They kicked. They're hell of beasts, and these were pretty beefy ones. I mean, the destriers were muscular beasts. Were pretty tough. You know, the destrier was something like 150, even more centimeters tall. It's shoulder, right? The withers, excuse me, that is a pretty big animal. Consider men were a little bit shorter than today because of poor nutrition and other factors, but you know, it's really massive as a beast, so this idea of your horses are my property, or is already speaking you at the level of political centralism, that tendentially, even if under a feudal, hence largely decentralized system, is taking place. And that in the Near East was probably enhanced at a certain level. Like the Kingdom of Jerusalem initially was very centralized for those time standards, because these were powers created out of scratch. Theoretically, at least they were re-equilibrated in the moment of the conquest at the benefit of a more central direction, which was what these nobles were trying to achieve, knowing how in Europe now this rooting of feudalism had kind of ruined a lot of aspects of, you know, the possibility of governing, and where, however, was taking place a pretty deep effort to centralize what was happening, even through the Crusades, even about through the direction of the Crusades, right? And this testimony of 1110 is believed to be at least one of the earliest, or if not the earliest, recorded instance of restore, but quite surely it's not, in my opinion. At least historically speaking, surely it wasn't. Like, meaning that in actual fact, surely these things already existed before, but this may be, because I don't know, frankly, but surely one of the first ones, at least, documented to us. So there is the problem now where these horses came from. So many of them, of course, you know that there are different types of horses. Thinking about the destrier, thinking about the runner, thinking about the roncin, and there were, as we've seen, many breeds and types, or types, if you, depending on how you want to call them, because we don't know exactly to classify them. Some might have been actual breeds, some might have been actual types, and it's different to distinguish it, because we don't know, we don't have the horse in front of us, we don't understand it well. However, it seems that most of horses, so also the ones that were the most, not really throwaway, because even the cheaper ones were something, economically speaking, but at least the most common ones, the runners, right, came chiefly from these close lands of Syria and Cyprus, right. Arab steeds were particularly highly prized. Usually the Arab, you know, that there is this idea that the Barb or the Berber horse is, even William the Conqueror had one. And there is in fact this idea that Europe had imported certain breeds from North Africa, from Spain, right? But at that point we don't know, and we will see it when we will talk about the Reconquista, whether those were actually, because these are names, right? And this might have been whether they were autochthonous races, which seems to be the case actually, because there wasn't any particular difference documented over the centuries apparently. Looking even at the genetics of today's horses, and evidently, however, in the Near East, you know, it was full of Arab steeds, in the sense that there were horses that were there, like, I don't know, in Egypt, in Arabia, whatever, you know. And you know that at that point, especially Turkish horses had been probably imported largely. Arabia doesn't have a big deal of horses, initially speaking. The first, I made a video about the early Islamic armies, I mean the ones of the conquest. Arabs prevalently fought on foot. Of course, they had cavalry, but they mainly started developing it after they seized certain areas of the Near East and Mesopotamia, and started also importing them from places like Persia or even far beyond, right? So even, Arab steeds, what does it mean practically? It sounds more like a name. Just bear in mind that now everything was Arab in the measure. I mean, even in Egypt they spoke Arab, right? They still do. So that's the point, right? This was Arab means as Arabic as something that belongs to this broader Islamic and Arabic-speaking world of the surroundings of the Ottoman states, right? And of course, in fact, there were other horses, however, who were more distinguished, coming from other areas that had their own ancient equestrian traditions, but that we objectively know were the case, like the Kurdish and Persian ones, had very high price. Marco Polo, writing in the 13th century, defines them as fine steeds of great value, etc. As you know, Marco Polo traveled allegedly up to China, so he basically went across all the Silk Road and looking at this peoples between the steppes and the sedentary world were, objectively were pretty damn good horsemen. So there were also so-called Turkoman or Turkan horses that were used, but this seemed strangely, however, from my opinion, to have been smaller, or at least, well, okay, I trust what I'm reading, but I think there were probably many differentiations ones in there too, and so I will have to look more thoroughly into this. And there were also other good horses, for example, coming from Cilician Armenia, that was this territory between the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic East, and the Crusader states, that sometimes were even more allied with the Muslims against the Byzantines and Crusaders, also because it was in the middle, right? It was a power in its own. The Armenians being good cavalrymen, and I made a video about the Cilician Armenians, and we will keep doing them at some point. That were smaller as well, right? And in fact, these types of horses, like the Turkoman and Armenian ones, were ridden mainly by sergeants, simply. The sergeants, whatever you want to call them, the servientes in Latin. This is kind of normal, meaning that theoretically the segmentation was, okay, the big male knight is fighting at this three. Ideally, they rode runners as well often, but theoretically the sergeant, this help, or even squires, or the whole thing was pretty mixed. Maybe even Turkomans at one point, smaller horses, right? They were more agile. They had to support the heavy horsemen, right? The heavy horseman at this point starts being like a modern tank, right? It's so loaded in armor that even your eyesight and ear is hearing is reduced. So you need actually your squire to from the back, running back and forth, looking around you, saying look right, look left, because you really need to direct yourself in an effective way. Chiefly, the mount, the male knight has to ideally charge with all this compact, thickly packed formation frontally, right? Because the horses are big and they tire themselves with their with the knight's weight, right? At this point, somewhere like in the 13th century, especially, probably a tiny elite of the even Crusader knights was armored in part. There had always been parts of armored in the sense of metal, right? There had always been parts of metal in horses' armor scattered here and there in the army, but only for the elite. And also that makes weight, right? So there is an ideal segmentation. Is also political and social segmentation. Who is more heavily equipped, right? But you can't have an army just of heavily equipped people. You need someone who supports them, who makes the wall formation much more flexible and reactive, right? So this sergeant had smaller but kind of hardy horses that were pretty fit to the task, right? They could even, of course, engage in combat, but also kind of running around, maybe supporting, being ridden by a missile trooper, maybe, because you have to think that squires, but actually even knights sometimes did use missile weapons. The myth that knights didn't use crossbows or bows is kind of, in fact, a myth. Of course, it wasn't particularly widespread among them, but first of all, every nobleman knew how to use a bow, simply because hunting was the aristocratic sport pro excellence, which was basically war simulation by a certain standard. It's actually, there's not much difference between killing a person and an animal, and another animal. Let's be specific about, and realistic about it. Simply that their tactical specialization in the field could afford better than that, but surely, certain side weapons, could be crossbows, etc. Aside from the chivalric idealizations, right? So also in there, horse archery was an Eastern Western thing, because actually we do know, but it's pretty obvious. Like even a Norman knight was an excellent horse archer. Why shouldn't we think so? The fact that in the regular use they didn't use bows and preferred to concentrate their force in a crusade lengths, thickly packed formation charge, right, is another story. It doesn't tell us that those knights didn't know how to use other weapons. Also because, let's be honest, medieval knights are basically one of the peaks, absolute peaks of military historical professionalism, so which means that a European knight, as much as a Near Eastern knight, were trained to use literally every single possible weapon existing at the time, right? And pretty damned well by all standards, right? So we don't have to be dogmatic about this either. And yet we also have to be able to understand what happened on the field and why it happened in that way. So not to say, okay, well, these were, just soldiers using whatever they wanted. No, there was a logic that forced them to behave in a certain way, to be equipped accordingly. And always remember that it's normally tactics that dictate which weapons are to be used, and not vice versa, right? But we know, for example, that Templar statutes, that those are terrific sources that are very overlooked, by the way, but they do indicate that commanders, as well as the Grand Master and other officers, also had a Turkoman horse each, right? This is pretty, there is nothing excessively strange about it. Also because normally the knights had spare horses of some sort, and usually they weren't like two destriers. They were maybe usually one destrier, maybe another horse. Maybe they start to be towards the 13th century, 14th, even more, right? And they reflect in part this segmentation also. Maybe now it's complicated to explain it, but this will also evolve into tactical nuclei, right? With actual horsemen that fight alongside, right? Especially towards the 13th century, the difference between squires and between knights and squires in terms of equipment or skills are basically falling apart, right? They're basically the same people in terms of combat capabilities. This is another part of the story. Again. Now, there is a problem of replenishment that we hinted at, that is the communications, right? European horses came, of course, from Europe all their way to the Holy Land. There is an evolution of the ways through which Crusaders started. The Crusades start as land journeys, right? It eventually, since the third, become fundamentally maritime journeys. And they were perilous, like, they were risky travels, and some of them very harsh conditions as well. So at least, according to many, reasonable amount of sources say, and reliably, many horses either died or didn't last. I mean, it was a pretty exhausting journey for men and horses alike. But this hasn't to do properly with the quality of European horses as such. This happened also in Muslim armies. Military expeditions are pretty hard things. We can barely imagine what it meant to travel, like in the 13th century, right? It was an exhausting, like in the Crusaders' times, let's say 11, 12, 13. It was exhausting, right? And it was obvious to lose men, animals, supplies, whatever, right? So these were tough journeys, and of course many died. Maybe by exhaustion or starvation or wounds. So even before they reached actually the outermost states. So this was a further problem, right? So think about the losses and about the fact, and here we get a first hint about this, that if there was such a huge effort in spending money for making them come and even losing them eventually, because they remain in the bottom of the Mediterranean at one point. Well, there was a desperate need of them, and if they had been inferior or useless, also with so many horses around, why would have the Crusaders had to bring them to the Holy Land, right? And we do know, however, that there was a pretty well-established form of horses, supplies, replenishment, together with Europe. Especially the military orders frequently had horses sent out to them by ship from their European convents, Cistercian ones, right, with their crowns that were able to. They were pretty skilled in both agricultural production, breeding, etc. They were pretty resourceful and apt to the task. Remember that orders like think about the Templars, they had an enormous amount. I mean, literally an enormous amount of landed property in Europe, scattered everywhere. All over, especially in France, of course, but in England, Germany, Italy, even Spain, they were scattered everywhere. In fact, that's what was one of the reasons why at the end of the 13th and at the beginning of the 14th they were wiped out eventually by the French crown, because they wanted to cash fast by incorporating that land. Once the Templars had fallen in, the Holy Land was lost, and many of them weren't even veterans anymore. For saying there were regulations about this too that specified, for example, that no brother of the order was allowed to take a horse from Outremer back to Europe, right? If it should be posted, as it was saying at the time. It is very interesting because it proves also that, of course, horses were expensive, as we know, and that some Crusaders, in this case Templars, were trying sometimes to bring them back to Europe, right? The Muslims, as we will see now, there is this prejudice that for which they allegedly did not think much of European horses, but we have to be more cautious about that, especially the source that is often quoted for that, we'll see it later, actually says also other things about European horses that are more meaningful and also positive. But there is this idea that, the Muslims said, like, they were European horses were over large in the body and lacking in spirit, right? Then this was a cliche that maybe, of course, it was said, because, this is quoted from the source. And it was a bit of pride, this Muslims, their Turkic equestrian traditions, were extremely proud, of course, of their military traditions. They thought themselves as knights, right? There was a big component of the highly Persified Seljuk Turkish nobility that, had nothing really had actually a lot in common with the European one in terms of chivalric culture and chivalric values and pride about horsemanship, etc. It was pretty scattered, telling the truth. Also, Byzantines in part had other peoples around, and on average, Crusader knights were expected to serve either with 2 or 3 spare horses, and even sergeants sometimes had to have 1 remount, right? And this would go increasing over time, of course, and for reasons maybe now we don't have the time or the need to stress, but it has to do also with the increasing professionalization of warfare, the monetization of military service in the 13th century, about which I made a video, the general compacting of the tactical units that also saw this development, even in armor technology. The knights were becoming heavier, better equipped, more expensive, so the whole thing was becoming a more costly but also more lucrative business. So it was this competition that intensified even the material invested with horses, etc. So we have drawn this picture that I've tried to maintain neutral, right? Also not stressing too much the prejudices that existed about the alleged inferiority that didn't exist of European horses, Christian horses. It sounds bad to say Christian horses, but you understand what I mean, compared to the Islamic ones during the Crusades. So, as you know, let's shift a little bit to another tactical scenario, strategic theater. That is the Iberia of the Reconquista, of the Early Reconquista, telling the truth. So even a bit earlier in time. And as you know, this is an area where in the early 8th century the Muslims established their own power after having conquered the Visigothic kingdom, right? And pushing fundamentally north all the Christian refugees that recompacted around this polities that actually already existed, like in terms of lordships into the north, like it would evolve into the kingdom of the Asturias, and eventually from which Castile, Leon would evolve, right? This happened in 711, as you know, and it's interesting already because actually the Visigothic army at that time, the Visigothic kingdom was heavily weakened, actually, also internally, and especially internally, and it kind of vanished relatively easily. Not without a fight, though. The Visigoths were praising their Gothic migration era origins as cavalrymen. I mean, even the Franks that at that point were to develop actually a much stronger cavalry military system, still recognized as with this fellow of Germanic culture the primacy of honor, let's say, in the name of equestrian capabilities, right? In other words, the Franks were about to develop a true professional military force, heavy cavalry, still attributed to peoples like the Visigoths or the Longobards, this ancient horsemanship skills that objectively they had, and partly they still had, but in much less effective way now with sedentarization, also in places like that weren't particularly, especially Italy, not particularly, developing a big deal of cavalry. Iberia was a bit different in that sense, but also in here we should distinguish how much was the Visigothic, culture about horses compared to the Longobard one, but we don't care now. Maybe we will talk about this on another occasion. To make the long story short, however, the Visigothic cavalry gets defeated by this Muslim invasion force is largely about infantry. And this is often forgotten. The army that we think about, the Arabs all on horseback, like conquerors, like of the migration era. No, they weren't really like that at that point. Especially that branch that arrived to the Gibraltar Strait and invaded Spain in 711 was largely composed by infantry that was actually Berber infantry, North African infantry. And this already speaks for many things, and of course we don't know many factors about it, but first of all, we know that Arabs that came in Spain weren't primarily horsemen. And this is already an important datum, right? We know, unfortunately, a very few about the Muslim conquest of Iberia, right? Very, very, very few. However, we have sources like from 4th century, like Claudian, for example, that talks about the Berbers, right? So here we're just 3 centuries later, right? Yeah, those times were not very far. That says in his De Bello Gildonico, I translate of course, no other armor has the horseman, his steed knows not the rein, a whip controls it, there is no faith, no order in the ranks, which is the picture of a society, 4th century, okay, yeah, I mean the Battle of Mammoth, a bit about the Battle of Mammoth, that is from the 6th century, that speaks a little bit about the Berbers and their armies, right? And this is a bit stereotypical, but it's not very far from the truth. I mean, these were populations that had a very low... they were, first of all, very primitive in general, and secondly, they had a very few stratified society, which means that they didn't have a central power, which means they didn't have... Their armies didn't have the discipline deriving from a state that imposes it for large masses of men. Hence, they might have been hell of fighters, on horseback in terms of individual skills, but altogether they weren't a big deal. First of all, they weren't armored, it wasn't heavy cavalry, it was purely light cavalry, and pretty simple ones. So they were, the Berbers, as you know, were considered some of the pretty damn finest individual horsemen of the ancient world, but when it came to national cohesion of these armies and their tactics and the formation, control, whatever, they were, they had a very low military quality, because it's objectively collective performances that make the difference here. There is this prejudice that also some authors like Davies in his War Horse have stressed, and we don't exactly know why, for which according to whom, let's say better, the famous Iberian tradition of horsemanship that was famous in the Roman Empire, in that region, somewhat declined after the fall of the Western half and in early medieval times. Evidence, but who knows? And on the contrary, it's believed that the Muslims, by invading Spain, would have revived with this Barbs or Arabian steed breeds the local equestrian tradition. In order to support this, the author says something like, quotes a passage from the life of Saint Corbinian that was written actually in the second half of the 8th century by Arbe of Freisingen, in which the Iberian horse, I suppose here meant as a Muslim horse, right, is particularly commended, because he says this actually, that, this is in Latin, but the translation is, as the man of God, basically here he talks about this saint that goes in Italy, in the kingdom of the Longobards, and see what happens. As the man of God came to the castle of Trent, Husingus, appointed prince there by the king of the Longobards, coveted the man of God's horse when he saw the beauty of its form, but as he could not buy it, he ordered it stolen secretly. and down below the horse is referred to as Iberos, so Spaniard, Spanish. And what does this mean? Not much, actually. If I don't know much about these two works themselves, but if Arbe of Freisingen was writing this relatively to a pre-Islamic context, that life of Saint Corbinian was kind of a cross to, and I think this was happening before actually 711. Well, this wouldn't even be a proof that we're talking about what at the times of Arbe Iberian, hence Muslim horses were about, but this is rather speaking well of the Spanish or Iberian brand, and incidentally not about the Berber or Arabian one, Arabian type. This is meaningful, right? And this has given, however, historiographically this impression that, I don't know, for this interpretation, the sources that you understand is not particularly clear, that, you know, the Visigoths had somewhat made declining equestrian tradition. Why? While traditionally they didn't. It's possible. I mean, it's possible in the sense that, of course, there are other factors we have to consider. Objectively, the Roman Empire was quite careful about its military resources. They did have latifundia for training beasts, stuff like that. You know, the Visigoths didn't have the big structures. Of course, Visigothic Spain is actually one of the most intense. It's probably the most Romanized of all the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. But the Visigoths were famous in part for their cavalry, and why shouldn't they have maintained it? Especially given that in the Iberian, in the Visigothic kingdom, large estates kind of survived historically. And they were also a cause of the disgregation of the Visigothic kingdom, because basically the monarchy at the end of the kingdom didn't count anything. It was all about the ecclesiastical and say lay aristocracy that controlled the Toledo councils. It was an elective monarchy effectively, but no proof whatsoever. And there is not, and there is instead another author, that is Solinsky, that writes that points out something interesting. This anecdote from the Islamic author Ibn Bakr al-Tartushi from the 11th century, which basically, to make the long story short, talks about a frontier skirmish or encounter, let's say better, between a Moorish cavalry border patrol and a Spanish horseman, so a Christian Spanish horseman. So what he apparently, I believe, I suppose, because, you know, they're also determining the religion of whoever inhabited in the border of the Reconquista is pretty hard. Like, it wasn't literally Christians versus Muslims. It was a bit more messed up. I made some videos about it. If you go into the Medieval Iberia playlist, I made something about the Cid de Campeador, the Early Reconquista, and those and these environments. Here we are in the 11th century, and the story tells that this Spanish horde, this local, let's put it in this way, the border at this point was towards the north of Spain, right? So from the other side there were the Christian controlled lands. So the Spanish cavalryman challenges all the Muslim patrol to single combat, which is already very fascinating, because it tells you how much this idea of it was already very, you know, Indo-European in character and very Germanic. Maybe this northern Christian north had maintained it against the Muslims, etc. Even though the northern kingdoms of Spain didn't quite believe themselves as being much of a heir of the Visigoths as such, but mostly being about being Christians. Like, the defining thing was exactly religion at that point. But this individualism in fighting that is extremely meaningful, that by itself is not really a proof of particular military development, right? Challenging someone to single combat pertains to kind of more primitive societies, the less developed societies, where individual combat has more importance. Why? Because society is simpler, there are fewer warriors, everything is more based on the individual. But that can speak actually a lot for the individual's value, right? That a warrior in himself has an extreme individual ability, right? But he gets slaughtered by masses of trained formations that are not individualistic as individuals, but they work well in formation, right? That's the history of civilization in a nutshell. But still, the individual prowess in this case, especially as a mounted fighter, is amazing, because three of the Moorish patrol's riders take up the challenge, and one by one, so one after another, they are vanquished by the Spaniard and his agile horse, right? So the Islamic patrol leader now seeks for advice, and a senior officer produces a codger on a wiry old horse that was actually from the same border region in the north of Spain, far north of the Iberian Peninsula, right? And this old man rides up to the Spaniard, and after a brief combat, he comes back with the Spaniard's head. And at this point, the senior officer declares that in all the Muslim army, there would have basically been no one capable of such a feat, and yet that it was what it took to the best to the Iberian jinetes, right? So this northern border context, that is very close to the Asturias and therefore the Christian areas, is speaks pretty favorably for the local horsemanship training. Solinsky, this author, suggests actually that the old man that appears in the end and kills the Spanish horse was riding a horse used to deal with the semi-wild cow herds or even a bullfighter, right? So a tradition that was developing there, so you can easily understand that here the Muslims are theoretically, they make the civilized guys, the ones that objectively have. Maybe here by the 11th century, I don't know, because I think this is when the taifas were already in place, when the caliphate had already collapsed. But let's say that up to that point, the Muslims had the upper hand, militarily speaking, and these guys from the north, the Christian north, were like bitly, not really the barbarians, but you understand that those who lived in the poorest areas, in wilder areas, and so on. They had this more individualistic thing. So it's very meaningful that this older guy is also an old man, right? Here, obviously, it's a story. You don't have to believe it is true, but you have to believe it is plausible, right? That this old man from the northern frontier has seen it all before, and he's able to massacre this guy that is apparently a champion in combat. And this old man is from the same area, right? Independently of his religious background, whatever. Now I don't know. He was serving the Muslims, so many Christians did it too at that point. But it evidently speaks for an amazing local ability that the Muslims here didn't have. Right? So here, telling you the truth, I don't know whether the source is talking about the same 11th century, if it's a contemporary source talking about contemporary events, or talking about previous events when the caliphate was still standing, there was kind of a more permanent military force or whatever. I don't know. Nevertheless, it's very meaningful. And it tells that these Iberians there in the north were hell of horsemen. And Yeah, and we could go on. I mean, there are other examples. Here I'm reading from Jürg Gassmann's work. Actually, he points out the Battle of Poitiers, 732, stating, in fact, that the decision to dismount in part of Frankish cavalry was dictated by the tactical contingencies of the time. The Franks, by the time of the Battle of Poitiers, actually had already pretty good cavalry, right? It was exactly under Charles Martel now developing in towards the wave would kind of intensify its professionalism. The Franks the Carolingians were doing at that point a hell of work that will change the military culture of Europe a big deal, right? Even if over a long time, because it would take centuries to fully develop it. What they triggered there in today's northern France was a hell of a change. So that specific thing, that specific mention actually about the Battle of Poitiers is meaningful because it explains to you that even if you fight on foot, it doesn't mean that you can't fight on horseback. Well, the same goes for the Anglo-Saxons that we mentioned before. Cardini, for example, points out that during the Battle of Poitiers there is no proof that the Arabs were mounted either during the battle, right? Or at least no explicit mention. Then of course there were mounted troops, maybe, I don't know, but we don't have the proof that maybe at that point were large cavalry or mounted contingents, because at this point, telling the truth, they're talking about the 8th century, the practice of mounting and dismounting was much more present probably than later times. You know, in the time of the Crusades, the tactical specialization of cavalry is very advanced. So, which means that the knight is essentially trained ever more to make the horseman, even if he can equally fight on foot, like better than anyone else, still, individually. But this idea of switching mounted, dismounted fighting, it's totally fine. It doesn't, you know, if you find a battle in which you find guys fighting on foot, doesn't mean that there weren't horsemen, right? As well, and they weren't good ones. This is typical. Even the Normans, that are considered, in fact, some of the finest of their time, take the 11th century, you know, they were used to mount and dismount at the same time, and their equipment was fitting for it. So interestingly enough, Gassmann here points out which frankly surprised me, like, to hear, because I was telling to you before, is that there is no DNA evidence that from modern, of course, I don't know here if he refers to modern finds or not, maybe because I'm reading very fast, but it's probably written. But surely also from modern horses, and that there was this mix, right? That the Muslims brought barbs and Arab races that mixed into the Iberian ones. No, the Iberian one seems to have been for over a millennium pretty untouched in that sense. Horses were more or less the same thing, genetically speaking. So no proof on that level, which and what surprised me, it's not this one really, but the fact that seemingly there is no specific study on the Caliphate's cavalry, the Umayyad Caliphate's cavalry, which would be very interesting. And yet there is to consider, and here I quote Gassmann, who in turn refers from Nicole, that there is an evidence that the technical terminology in Iberia features both Arabified Romance and Romanified Arabic words, and posits a fusion of Visigothic and imported Arab equipment, weaponry, and styles. Right? And here in brackets, This is note 71, page 93. It says, Net also observe a similar fusion of Arabic, Byzantine, Persian, Mongol terminology in the Furusiya literature, right? And now that I think about it, I made a video about Umayyad infantry that incidentally talks also about Umayyad cavalry, right? And it is true, and there is, I would say in this, and I remember that I was quoting it from Nicole, that actually there is evidence in, first of all, there's a great homogeneity in material culture between northern and southern Iberia during the, that was about between the 8th and the 11th century, right? So we are in the early Reconquista. But also there are, however, in, specifically in, I think it was in actual finds of armor, and even some artistical depictions, certain Umayyad armors that look pretty Middle Eastern, probably either of Persian or Turkic. You know, they look at least origin, maybe, or at least of imitation. I don't know. However, from that specific Central Asian background, for saying what? For saying that it is normal, actually, that there were such mixes, right? Either in terms of vocabulary, excuse me, even in fighting styles, even sometimes even just in look, because sometimes we have to reason just coldly and rationally, saying, that armor was shaped in a certain way because it had that function, that's the only point. Well, yes, usually it's always like that by a certain margin, right? An overwhelming one, telling the truth. But sometimes certain armors and styles were just worn just because they, you know, it was a matter of fashion. I'm not kidding. Like, you know, war is also a big show-off. Whoever goes on a battlefield counts much more in influencing the spiritual, like the moral forces of the enemy than its strictly physical one. So even looking in a certain way, using certain weapons, certain armor, can be even more than just practical, right, or effective, or, you know, it can be also about the impression that you make on the enemy. And again, this is just for saying that, of course, you will find lots of stuff that probably the Arabs brought alongside with them. And always remember that also after the Muslim conquest, it's not that Muslim Spain was isolated from the rest of the world. Actually, there was this kind of broader Islamic pool, let's say, where you know, Spain was renowned. Even history of law, for example, was connected to Southern Arabia. There were lots of contexts. This thing of the Middle Eastern armor style found in southern Spain, yeah, why not? I mean, it's perfectly plausible. These guys controlled trade routes that stretched from the Atlantic to the Southeast Asia. So, you know, it's perfectly possible, right? But there is no evidence. This is what Gassmann is saying. This is pretty meaningful, that there is no direct evidence, and especially that that DNA thing was pretty impressive, that horses specifically in Spain were affected by an external influence of other breeds that were imported into Spain. There is no evidence of that, and frankly there shouldn't be. You know, why? You know, we don't have any other element that can tell us at this point that there had been a particular change in horse breeds and local military culture from late Roman times. Of course, there were changes. Of course, society changes, politics affects a lot of things, even the environment changes. Hell, it does happen. But as historians, we don't seemingly have any other evidence at this point that there was, you know, a massive change of local breeds coming from, you know, the Islamic East into this Iberian context. So I thought it was interesting to stop by the Reconquista a little bit, quoting this article, because that's an important theater of the Christian-Muslim clash, and therefore it makes you understand a lot. And consider too that at this time, especially towards the end of the 11th century, it was full of Frankish knights from places like France, from Germany, that went fighting into northern Spain. which caused in turn a Frankization of its of their military culture, right? Yeah, and that surely had made many Westerners acquainted that eventually would live for the Crusades later on at the end of the 11th century, acquainted with, let's say, a broadly Muslim fighting style that, of course, the way Umayyads, like the way Muslims fought in Iberia, Iberia was different from the one they fought in Near East, but still there were shared common features, right? So this is particularly important to think also in perspective. Like, we think that the Europeans came out of the blue, like from places like France or Belgium, and invaded Syria and Palestine, establishing the Crusader states, as if they'd never seen a Muslim before, they'd never fought. It was full of Westerners, since and we're talking about Western knights, generations before, even centuries before the First Crusade, scattered literally all over the Mediterranean and the Near East. They were all contractors, either for the Byzantines or even for the same Muslims. They had been going there since a long time. So this myth that the Crusades were this massive change, they opened Europe to who knows what, to these external influences they'd never known before, this is actually wrong. It has mainly to do with the same internal development of Europe, and not with what they were acquainted with these. Which is not to say, by the way, however, that the Europeans didn't import or imitate or take everything from the East. Actually, they did. Like, think about the culture, the development of books, etc. But we shouldn't exchange this for a sort of a previous inferiority, because if they did it, which they were doing it because they were doing it actively and not passively, they weren't exposed to this stuff because they were invaded, they were exposed to this stuff because they were willing to go out there and translate stuff from Arabic, right? Even if they wrote in Latin and they were Christians, they did whatever else, for the simple reason that they were already at that level of knowledge and interest. And that's what all the problem is about, that if you consider, always remember this, for history of technology and history of science, that if a people is able to adopt and replicate and even enhance, actually, one form of knowledge, of technology, etc., it is exclusively because that people is already at the level or beyond of the people that has taken that from. Hence, the myth of cultural appropriation is probably one of, in absolute terms, one of the single most stupid things that everybody can ever think of. Because humanity doesn't work with that, right? Okay. Because civilization is a serious thing, and you can't reduce it to stealing things, to copying things. This is the kind of things you hear around. Who uses this vocabulary usually doesn't have any idea about history of technology and how that works, and how, historically speaking, such things worked. And by the way, it wasn't mostly about technology. Today, say it once again, we are obsessed with technology. At the time, they weren't. At the time, they used it in an extremely pragmatic way. They weren't obsessed by technology itself. They had much more important concerns, objectively. They were much more pragmatically oriented people than we are today. They didn't need, let's say, artificial mental constructs. These were extremely. They had a very few. They had a very few theoretical intelligence. They adopted what they knew it could work, right? They were, of course, interested about a lot of concepts as well, but not in the way we do towards technology. That sometimes is done in quite an abstractive way, hence not applicable one. So going back a little bit on the Crusades once again, I mean in the one the Crusader states in Outremer, right? We have presented this broader picture fundamentally, and we had opened the video by saying that Crusader knights, these Franks as they were called, were considered as, or Latins, if it depends, were different denominations. The term Latin refers to the fact that they belong to the Latin Church and to the Roman Catholic Church after the schism of the 11th century. And there was a classicism, right? The Byzantines were mostly concerned about. And there are many beautiful quotes that here even Gassmann represents. The one is the most famous one is probably from Anna Komnena, right? That said, talking about the Franks, said, "For every Celt," which were how they called the Franks, because the Byzantines were so, if the Romans had called these guys that lived into that area of today's northern France Celts, why things should have changed? The Romans were perfect; they could never change, right? So hence, let's not call them as Franks; let's call them as Celts, because that's what the classical reality, that is all what we should be learning about, is, right? And therefore says every Celt is invincible both in attack and appearance when he is on horseback. Said by an imperial princess that actually was from a dynasty and in a certain particular history in the political, military, and social history of Byzantium. Oh, Byzantium, I said the word Byzantium, I'll say of the Roman Empire, Constantinople, that was stressing a lot, chivalric morals, essentially also because of Western influence, right? By the 11th century, and also especially in the previous century, the Byzantines had, because I feel sick saying Byzantium, but I don't feel a problem saying Byzantine interchangeably together with Roman, so forgive me my tastes. But the Byzantines were actually on the lead in terms of like equestrian technology, zootechnic, like they had received objectively by fighting a lot against lots of people from the Pontic steppes or from Persia, etc., and the Muslim powers at this point. An enormous experience that at least in the 10th century was probably unmatched by the West, Western Europe. That was the most advanced one, right? In terms of armor, weapons, tactics, zootechnic, and all this stuff. So that Anna Komnene that actually saw her father, conceived, of course, her father fighting, etc., and having this strongly chivalric pride as well. The Komnenians in the 12th century would participate even in tournaments in Antioch, in the same Crusader states, in the Byzantine emperor, like Michael Komnenos, in fact. That would say that these Celts, as she calls them, were invincible. And especially stressing invincible on horseback, of course, but especially saying both in attack and appearance. Now, this is very interesting because it doesn't say in defense. Also because cavalry, by definition, cannot defend. If there is something that the cavalry arm cannot do, is defending. Because if you have to do that, you have to dismount. You're better. So in attack and appearance is, however, stressing this extremely aggressive-minded attitude, I would say, of the Franks. Of course, the couché lance charge, and was a very technical thing, as we've said before. But even the appearance, as we said before as well, is a big deal. You have to look freaking terrible, and of course there are many other things that Anna Komnene says about the Franks, but that are not very pleasant. But nobody doubted, not even for a second, that these were the freaking best and invincible cavalrymen out there in attack. Now, do you realize what does it mean for a Byzantine empress that thinks that she's objectively like part of the unique and universal empire in the history of mankind, to admit that these guys that are at least Christians, right? Yeah, at least they are Christians, right? But they are kind of barbarians in other ways, for Byzantine standards, and probably not excessively, they were pretty rough, let's be honest about it. But they weren't barbarians, of course. Were invincible. They weren't Byzantine horsemen, they were Frankish ones, right? And we all know, in fact, that revolving relatively to the events revolving around the First Crusade and the previous Battle of Manzikert, about which I made a 3 hours and a half video on, the Byzantines highly prized Frankish knights by hiring them en masse, right? The big thing after Manzikert, the Byzantine emperor writes to the Pope saying, "Send us knights," right? And what he meant was mercenaries, right? The popes were thinking about something else called crusade, right? For which the Byzantines eventually freaked out, because it was completely unconceivable in their culture, the political, religious culture, etc., that a bishop like the Pope of Rome could tell monarchs when to send armies and troops. However, in several videos made about the Crusades, at least I should mention that this thing that the Crusades were triggered by the Byzantine request is a grossly overestimated thing, right? And it stresses in part the meaning of today's video, that is to say that what happened with the Crusades was something big and deep, and that we can understand only up to a certain point, that developed from within the West, right? Also because when the Crusades were launched in the 90s of the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks were in full decline, right? They weren't the full threat that they could appear after Manzikert. They had fragmented dramatically, but that was not the point. The Crusades weren't launched because the Byzantines phoned and said, "Hey, yo, send us troops." No, it didn't happen like that, really. Even if, of course, the Byzantines at one point were also very clever at exploiting the situation, trying first of all to divert the same threat that the Crusader expeditions posed to St. Constantinople, because what happened in 1204 might have easily happened even before, and it's not that the Crusaders, and they were right, trusted the Byzantines much more than the Muslims. Actually, they were on some occasion much more friendly and reliable Muslim allies of the Crusades than the Byzantines, and vice versa, right? Because we have to be extremely honest about such things. Like in every other context, this is not about Crusaders or Byzantines or Muslims. This is about really how human polities behave at every single moment. And there is this anecdote that Gassmann quotes in the note 73, that quotes from the horsemen sent by the Count of Flanders, about 500 picked men, arrived and brought as a present to the emperor 150 selected horses. Moreover, they sold him all the horses they did not require for their own use, which is interesting, because here we have Byzantines buying literally Frankish horses, so Western European horses, and these were the Byzantines with all their equestrian traditions buying Western Frankish horses. Do you understand what it means? And continuing to quote, the emperor welcomed them very graciously and returned hearty thanks. This thing, even Charlemagne sent diplomatic gifts with horses to the Caliph of Baghdad, right? To whom was allied against the Byzantines. Just for saying that this thing of the horse is an old thing, that it didn't start from out of the blue, right? And I think that that it's very important to stress it, because you can see how far go these yeah. So and here there is also this other quote, very interesting. For of a sooth he, Nicephorus, knew how to brandish a spear and cover himself with a shield, and anyone seeing him ride would have conjectured that he was not a Roman, but had come from Normandy. Ah, this is beautiful. Like, this is literally saying that that the Byzantines considered their best horsemen on the measure of the Norman ones. Now, this is freaking amazing, and this makes you understand why the Byzantines that were fighting also since a much longer time than the Crusaders then against the Muslims and their cavalries considered their very best cavalry that was even superior sometimes to the Muslim one wars as an anecdote to the Norman one. So it rather seems that these Westerners, were capable of doing things that if you really had bad horses, as we were saying before, would have not been feasible. And this is the freaking amazing thing that I love to point out. And it is really true. And here when he says to come from Normandy, I would like to add something that is sometimes overlooked. I don't know that we like to talk about the Normans because they are objectively and well and justly remembered as some of the finest cavalry of the High Middle Ages. However, we should point out that at this point the Norman cavalrymen, whether they were the ones of Normandy proper or the ones that invaded England as a consequence, and so that type of Normans, these knights at that point, to make it simple, really the knights of William the Conqueror were the literal same identical thing incontrovertibly than a Western Frankish knight, hence a French knight, right? What we would call it today. What does it mean? Well, it means that, as you know, the Normans settled as Vikings when they were Vikings, were settled in Normandy, as you know, in the lower Seine basin. And albeit they probably knew cavalry and they knew how to use it pretty well, they surely at the time didn't know how to use it as well as the Franks. Not because they were stupid or they were inferior or all this other garbage, but because simply they didn't have in Scandinavia the society they had in France, right? Which means enormous landed property concentrated into the hands of a single guy that therefore could spend literally his entire lifetime on horseback. Okay, not literally, that was not a Mongol, but still, let's say the good season, literally on horseback for all his life, and training just for that. So that's what transforms them into knights. Albeit the Normans, specifically of Normandy, learned how to go on horseback by the Bretons, that were also pretty damn good horsemen in their own regard, and learned the heavy cavalry shock heavy cavalry tactics from, of course, the Western Franks, the French, right? And they were literally the same identical thing, and more than that, the more we go on in the 11th and 12th century, basically every single Western knight, mailed knight, is literally the same thing. That is, from Galicia to Poland to from Norway to Sicily, every Western knight is a single thing. Like, you can find differences in equipment. You can say, oh well, the Spanish cavalry were a bit more like jinetes, those are minimal differences. The heavy guy is essentially the same thing everywhere, right? It's literally the same thing everywhere, and you can see it because the Western Europeans had a dramatically homogeneous military development from those centuries onwards, and this is a product, if you want, of the Carolingian empire in perspective, in what the Carolingians, more than the empire, what their vassalitic beneficiary system developed and intensified, that at this point was spreading together with feudalism making every Western European basically knowing how to fight in a single way. Of course, maybe there were differences of some sort, but the concept and the essential is the same, right? And the proof is actually that if you look at Byzantine and Islamic sources, there is not much of a difference between, like, these guys could come from either from Normandy, of course, it could come from France, it could come from Germany, it could come from Norman Sicily, from wherever, like, and sometimes were conceived rightfully the same thing, because they fought in the same way. The Normans conquered Sicily as well, so that's Western Frankish military culture implanted in there, and much more, because as we've said before, these guys traveled far and wide across the Mediterranean and beyond to fight basically with every other kind of cavalryman that existed anywhere there, right? And that's all the epopee of chivalry, right? You know, and this adventure that the Crusade was, this journey, this pilgrimage, this whatever you want to call it, it was a big deal, right? It was an essential thing. It wasn't just an activity, it was a spiritual journey. So with that, if you do it on horseback as a mailed knight, massacring enemies and friends alike sometimes, because, you know, it's not that we're mentioned, you know, crossing the Balkans, you know, there were certain populations that the same Crusaders probably liked worse for their fierce nature and combative skill than the same Muslims. Read the Bulgarians, because that is a true story, by the way, who also had their own equestrian tradition, in fact, originally very well developed, and we don't have any measure to say that it stopped, right? So the same Turks, the same Saracens, where you even want to call them at one point, actually say that these Franks are pretty damn good, right? And there is this source which is the same Usama, if I'm not excuse me, no, Abu Bakr, not Sayyid, I think that is from the 14th century, so it's a very late source. That is the most quoted source talking about the Frankish horses as bad and soft, right? But a very few authors, Gassmann points out, actually talk about the two other references to the so-called Frankish horses of the same author. One actually states that they're not easily startled, which is a big deal, right? Because horses are easily startled. I mean, it depends, you know, and the fact that they weren't, it's because they were well trained, well chosen, well selected, and they belonged evidently also to masters that through which together with whom they had gone through pretty bad stuff, right? And the other thing is that says that the European horses had a curved neck. That is not actually criticism, because it says that it's a beauty flow, right? So not really, it's more of an aesthetical thing. I don't know if this has to do maybe with the structure of the horse, the physical, the performance. I don't know. I don't think so. But in this horse, if I understand correctly, this is stated just as a beauty thing, like an aesthetical thing. Yeah, and there are many other, of course, of course, the same military history. Before we talk about the Battle of Dorialium, the Battle of Arsuf, that show actually how resilient and capable and aggressive and successful Western cavalry tactics could be also against the Turkish ones, right? So the Turks were counting on creating disorder into the Crusader ranks to make their own, eventually their Arab heavy cavalry capitalizing upon it and charging at the end. There is also, in fact, this prejudice that we have as Westerners, I must say, that the Arabs didn't have as heavy cavalry as we had. Now, that's kind of wrong, right? I'm the first one actually who thinks that yes, probably Western tactics were more reliant on heavy cavalry, but this doesn't mean that the Arabs didn't have. Possibly they had less, or better, maybe they had a tendency to be kind of to be surrounded by lighter elements that were mostly about missile fire. Yeah, we know this, but the Arabs, the Turks, etc., were actually pretty. They had excellent cavalry, right? And and they came from a bit old military traditions. Of course, the cavalry was mostly kind of a Turkish thing at this point. As you know, even the Mamluks would take over Fatimid. Excuse me. Well, the Ayyubids they were a Kurdish dynasty actually. Take over Fatimid Egypt, and then eventually the Mamluks arrived. So those were all peoples that had that particular background. That dated back as a military culture to the steppes, so not really, a place where cavalry warfare is unknown, and so there would be a lot. It's difficult to assess certain things about the real practice of warfare, right? When we talked about Turkomans, Turkopoles, and I also made that video about Franks and Byzantines in the Seljuk armies. If you are interested, that tells you how much actually Muslim troops relied on Christian cavalry. It was full of Christians into Muslim armies, and it's almost unbelievable. Actually, it probably were many more Christians into Muslim armies than vice versa, as far as I understand. But I should check that better. And there is also a technical why does that happen? Well, evidently because the same Muslims needed that Franks that were most of the times basically all cavalry. There is infantry as well, but they're mostly cavalry, which means that if these Muslims had such superior cavalry, why would they need Frankish one? Of course, there are other elements like politics. Mercenaries can be useful in their own regard, but flattening the thing down in this homogenizing panorama, which actually is the case, it means that this Eastern world also needed Western cavalry technology, or whatever you want to call it, and because these enemies had created problems, right? Sometimes this cavalry was used against other Frankish cavalry, and it's a big deal because at the Battle of the Relium, when the Turks found out that they couldn't pierce through the Frankish mails, and that all their tactics was good to nothing, because at the end of the day they would exhaust their bows without wiping out the enemy force, that maybe was startled and paralyzed, but definitely not wiped out. What the hell? You need to make a change here. Interestingly, Gassmann quotes that during the at one point that there was the smooth bow that basically the Turks began to develop in order to increase the penetrating power. The Turkish angular bow was too weak to penetrate Crusader mail and gamps from afar at least, because this is also like when you have like hundreds of arrows shot at you, yeah, you can have the best protections, but you can't be sure that, I don't know, a splinter, everything can go wrong theoretically, but statistically, that worked, and that's why they wore that kind of armor. As I was saying before, even Gambazon can make miracles sometimes. And yes, this is where he quotes that at note 75, and but also the other very important thing that he points out, and I want to thank him in particular for this, is that he talks about the Crusader crossbows, right, that are often said like kind of one of the things that are more ideally drawn from the East, right? The idea that the crossbow develops during Crusades as an Eastern because of Eastern influence, it doesn't seem to me, honestly, that even these Arab militias of the local city-states of Mediterranean, whatever, made such an extensive use as, for example, the Italians did of crossbow, or in fact how much crossbow developed. Right? It does seem actually that if you take Richard Lionheart, that also made at Arsuf, had his Genoese crossbowman doing a freaking amazing job, and now we will talk about that. But yeah, there are these anecdotes that say that basically Richard discovered that, hence England would discover that the crossbow only at that point in the mid-12th century. Other regions of the Mediterranean, in fact, already widely used it, and you know that crossbow, in general, every kind of fast projectile, like of long-range missile weapon, is more easily developed into naval warfare, which is a thing. I mean, even during the Viking era, you can find the Norwegians making apparently much more use than the longbow, because they were mostly doing naval warfare, given that Norway doesn't have much of an hinterland, if not mountains, and therefore there is just the sea. And equally, the Italians make an extensive use of crossbow, mostly because they were engaged into naval warfare against the Saracens. You could have said, well, maybe they did use it as well. Yes, it's likely, but there is also to remember one thing, though, that first of all, crossbow becomes paradigmatic for all Western armies spreading from these regions of the southern Mediterranean, right? Which is not the same thing for the Muslim East. The Muslim East has a much longer reliance on bow, which normal bow. That doesn't mean that the crossbow didn't exist. It did exist, of course, but we will have to go a bit more in depth into that, because these two areas reacted in a different way, which would suggest that actually Europe was a more fertile ground for the development of certain stuff that wasn't equally developed than in other places. I'm fairly positive that the trebuchet, for example, was more like of an Eastern development, but also about that, I'm skeptical we should see that, because things like those conceptually had existed, like even if they weren't with the counterweight, they were just a muscular force, but that idea conceptually is out there. And even the one of the crossbow, to be honest, it was out there since a very long time. Like already Romans used crossbows, even the classical Greeks used crossbows. They weren't as powerful as the medieval ones, as objectively not even the trebuchet was as powerful as the ancient ballistas, contrarily to what many people presume, at least, because medieval siege warfare was pretty much more precise and powerful than the Roman one, just for the record. But the point is, this concept of having a string that you can basically, mechanize what you usually would do via muscular force by drawing the bow, etc., in one shot, was already there. You can't properly say, at this point the crossbow disappears and reappears. Yeah, we lack direct evidence, but it's not that we can't think it disappeared ever at one point, because the concept is so banal. Like, even when I was a kid, I built crossbows. I didn't need who knows which technology in order to do that. Okay, now you think that I built crossbows when I was a kid, but yeah, I mean, conceptually, I was able to reproduce something similar to it. Because, of course, I knew what it was, but, I mean, it's not difficult to do once you have an elastic stuff. It's more about the costs, benefits of these weapons that entails their development than the actual concept of it. It's not that in early medieval Europe people had forgotten torsion catapults because they were dumb. It's because they were too damn expensive for besieging a moat that you could simply storm or, wait for it to surrender, right? That's simple basic intelligence, right? And it's just modern people are so stupid to pretend that technology has to be forcibly applied in a place where it can't take root, right? So the concept here is, however, that the crossbow is inherently a much more functional army than the bow. Let's be honest about it. That we have matured this prejudice that's, I would say, stems chiefly from the celebration of the longbow during the 100 Years' War. I mean, this idea that longbow was intrinsically superior to the bow, because everybody knows, that the bow can fire at a much speedier rate, a much higher rate than the crossbow. Yes, but unfortunately you then take into consideration the crossbow has a freaking much longer range than a bow, right? And if that was only the problem, basically every kind of longbow would have been massacred by any crossbowman. But the point that it was not the case tells you much more about say the doctrine of employment of these weapons, and the fact that medieval battles were in fact much less technologistically driven than other things. Don't quote me Crecy, because at the Battle of Crecy, the Genoese crossbowmen were misused in a dilettante way, in an amateurial way, right? And it's pretty silly to assume that everything stands into the performances of a weapon, right? Even if objectively talking about the longbow, the English longbow, the 14th century, 15th century specifically, that was a hell of a weapon, right? It was, even in me, who believes, as you understand at this point, that such weapons were, that it's more weapons adapting to tactics than vice versa. Actually, in the case of the longbow, you gotta admit that that was a hell of a weapon. And just for you to know, the English victories during 100 Years' War thanks to the longbow are in the world military history actually the single most successful ones in conditions of approximate symmetry than in any other historical period. That is to say, the English armies of Edward III were objectively the strongest in history on that, in conditions of rough symmetry, which is objectively true, because such a series of victories in such dire conditions, and especially numerical inferiority, are not to be found in any other singular realistic historical context, right? And that's not English chauvinism, I can assure you. So speaking of this, the crossbows are employed by the Crusaders with extreme function, right? With extreme success. There is a wide set of situations where you see that the Crusader armies had a missile fire that was outstanding, right? While the Turks had to basically implement their own bows to cope with Crusader armies, right? And most of the times they couldn't even come to grip with Western cavalry, because they sometimes they discharge all of their projectiles before they could make a sensible impact on the enemy, in order to eventually charge him with the heavy cavalry they had in turn. And this speaks for a freaking great effectiveness of Crusader armies. There is also this very interesting quote from Raymond de Aguilera that Gassmann points out. Is very fascinating. It says, "Yet the Turks and Arabs who confronted the Count of Flanders turned to flee as they saw that the matter was to be settled up close with swords rather than arrows from afar. The Count Bohemond pursued them for 2 miles, and as you'd see, sheaves lie repeated in the field, so you'd see the bodies of the dead strewn in that space." Right? And here Gassmann actually quotes an author that says the complete, a modern scholar that says a complete different thing, saying how striking the difference is, for saying that medieval source tells you plain and simple that the Turks not only cannot come to, when they see that they had to fight hand to hand with the Crusaders, they flee, but that also the Crusaders are able to pursue the Turks in arms. If they had such splendid mounts that could run far away, much farther than those lazy, less intelligent, less trained, and less suited Crusader horses, how is that the latter managed to pursue these guys and butchering them down, right? And another thing that Gassmann points out is very interesting. He's also considering certain stocks of horses that were of southern Europe, where in summer, that the climate is pretty damn hot, and therefore we know that actually Crusaders used southern French, Iberian, Sicilian, Neapolitan, Apulian, and Calabrian horses. And I challenge you to fight dressed up like a 12th century medieval knight in July or August in places like southern France or in Calabria or in southern Spain, and we'll see that. What do you feel like? And this means that those horses were actually also pretty well suited to kind of the similar climate like you can find in the Near East, right? Okay, southern Europe is a bit different, but still it in terms of sheer temperatures, right? It's pretty damn hot. And don't think that in places like Central Europe or even Northern Europe, fighting in summer with that equipment is so pleasant. It is not. You risk, even in terms of health, to collapse, to get a heart attack or something, because and this tells you also about not just the training of the horses, that is what we're talking about, but the training of the horsemen. Even if objectively one of the animals is much more praisable, considering all the weight they have to sustain, right? So definitely the picture we're getting here is a much more realistic one than Crusaders having worse horses than the Muslim ones, right? This is not true. So you could go as far as saying that actually the Crusades didn't even change much in regards of the practices of this is another interesting chapter, practices of warfare itself. Another cliche that you hear a lot of is that basically the Crusades brought the tactics of the Turks, like feint flights and ambushes and flank attacks, rear attacks, from the Holy Land, which is true. There are many sources, especially during the 13th century, where this kind of tactics are starting to be replicated astonishingly often into Western Europe. That rendered this plausible, historically speaking. I have doubts about this as well, however, because aside from the fact that I made a master thesis, one of the major battles of the 13th century Europe that actually saw the use of these flank attacks, and therefore I discussed the thing, and I have my own ideas, and I don't ask you to agree with me, but at least to consider my thoughts, is that you don't really need to conceive a flank attack with a concealed force when basically entire practice of warfare everywhere in the world, when armies become organized enough to carry out certain things, which actually a flank attack doesn't even have to have by a certain degree, it's not really surprising, right? Concealing a shock force that hasn't even to maintain cohesion, like, because it can just run into the enemy. If it's attacked from the side, you can easily mess it up, its whole formation. It's mostly a problem of communication and deciding when to attack, which is not about being, used to Turkish warfare, to Western European warfare. It's about, having enough competence about how men fight and behave and think and fear in a fight, right? Well, I think that the Crusades, in part, were an event that probably catalyzed this transformation, that however would have happened anyway, and probably in that same century, because it was the intrinsic limits of European warfare that were being surpassed because of the political and social developments of those countries, right? So I don't see it as a big deal either, but I reserve myself to deepen this topic as well one day. We talked before about the use of missile troops on horseback from the side of Western Knights, which is something that was issued actually since Carolingian times, but never took root, apparently at least. But we have seen how every single horseman in Europe could easily use one. In the 14th century, they would become increasingly more frequent, but since the 12th, even before, we find crossbowmen on horseback. So the myth that such weapons were not used and that it completely false. Please don't spare me the wishful thinking of the Lateran councils, right? The Lateran Council, actually, of what was 1132, I don't remember, that forbade crossbow, but to no use. And also in there, it's the story is poorly told because it doesn't say exactly that in how we meant it as a sheer use of it. But anyway, warfare evolves in spite of external influences, right? It changes with politics and society. And it doesn't seem that 10, 12, and 13th century developments of Europe can be considered as, a consequence of the Crusades. There are people who actually believe this. I think it's utter rubbish, with all the due respect, because there is no... I think all we know about the socio-economical revival of Europe starts much before. I made several videos covering these topics in Medieval Society playlist, and this is not me having an opinion. This is widespread academic consensus on it, right? So there's nothing ideological behind this. Of course, crossbows. We have talked about their importance. The very paced, frequent fire of Genoese crossbowmen during battles like Arsuf was crucial, right? Very well ordered, very well coordinated, and it was enough to keep at bay Turkish cavalry for the mailed knights to coordinate their attack, their charge. So yeah, this is also true, and we could spend countless times, like, even, for example, take the same Arab military culture. Arab military culture is very interesting, and very few people get interested into it, especially in pre-Islamic times, and even after post-Islamic times in Arabia, because most of what happens, Islamically speaking, it was outside of Arabia, because not even Arabia was immediately Islamic. It was just maybe nominally, but there were lots of pagans for centuries and centuries, up to arguably very recent in times. And originally, the Arab warfare was, however, largely on foot. Yeah, okay, there were these Mordeirs, Bedouins, on horseback, on camelback, that, however, were let's say, they were a complement. They were a bit like those Berbers we were talking about before. The Arabs themselves actually began to develop their own heavier and larger cavalry corps later on in time, when they start conquering places like the former Roman and Persian empires, lands where certain traditions were in use since a long time. And of course, Turkish and Kurdish horses were also prized, right, among the Arabs and in the Islamic world, worldwide. Worldwide. In the area, especially, yeah. in the Abbasid Caliphate, in Fatimid Egypt, whatever. So it would be interesting to study the evolution of Arab chivalric culture as well, right? And confrontating it even with these other non-Turkish communities that eventually were to serve and were to operate with these mercenaries all the time, coming from Central Asia. Where is the local militia organization tradition end up in Muslim history? What is the why is that at a certain point the Turks really took over all in military, the Turks and the Kurds with this horse archery and heavy cavalry? It's a big question, because the Mamluks ended up to create one of the single most powerful entities in Islamic history at one point, and through that same model. So that was very different from what even the initial Abbasid, like the first Umayyad and then the Abbasid caliphates that were essentially very similar as conceptually in terms of political military practice to the Byzantine Empire, or at least they had mostly the centralized, more even infantry-based troopers that eventually they start substituting even with cavalry in such large numbers that eventually the same Baghdad is kidnapped by the Seljuks that extend their protections over it, in this bit of a hypocritic way, So yes, these are the conclusions I wanted to get to today, and I think it's worth of the pain reflecting on these topics. And so, first of all, I want to thank a lot Jürg Gassmann for what he told me with this article, and for what it provided to this reflection. And I would be very interested to know more, right, for about these topics, and I will keep digging into academia, which I rarely do. But when I, at least I rarely did, because now when I look into a bit more thorough historical problem, especially military history, I like to deepen always more, time allowing. So sometimes I rarely find something specific about certain topics, but aside from the books I already have, but this one was very fresh. It was article from 2017, if I'm not wrong. So it's well updated, let's say, and I hope I've given you some hint about the general framing of this period, right? We haven't talked just about horses. We have talked also about military technology in general, tactics, military culture, and a lot of other things that I hope are have been clear. The thing that struck me the most is the rule of the temple, when it says that these horses that were imported and were so prized. Why would the Crusaders import with such huge expenses and costs of organization, of logistics, etc., to have breeds that were allegedly inferior to the local ones, especially the heavier horses? I mean, maybe this reflection that I missed was, of course, the Crusaders made extensive use of local breeds, but chiefly for lighter horses, like for the runners. But when it took the heavy shock horses, well, those were imported from Europe, which is very meaningful. Then I'm sure that some Crusader mounted heavy stallions from Central Asia, right? But of course they did. But those European ones seem to have worked well enough, or at least even if there had been differences of sort, which is possible. When Abu Bakr says, those horses maybe are just soft, but it's possible. There is this cliche that the Eastern horse is kind of more hot-tempered, resilient, but come on, I mean, what for? Like, this is a hotly debated thing, and because every horse can be both things in some way, so it depends. It is true that horses have different spirits, right? But do they really vary so much compared to these breeds, relative to these breeds, or is there something more? And horses can adapt also as men, as they do, and after all, there weren't so many differences. I think the latter is more plausible, especially considering the outcomes, which is, as you have understood now, what we mostly base ourselves on. Alright, so I think for today we can stop it here. I hope once again that you have gotten this broader picture, maybe to widen a little bit your range of food for thought, right? And especially trying not to sclerotize everything in kind of a dogmatic approach. No, everything was black or white, you know. Everything was shaded, and even the shades change very often. So the important thing is to understand the substance of the story, the essence of the story. And I think that these things we've talked about today are very, very meaningful. And yeah, and as I said before, I will leave you Jürg Gassmann's article in the description below. And I thank him once again. Take his chance. And for now, it's all. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.